Madame Lagarde, thank you so much for joining us here in Bloomberg and in Venice at the G20. When you look at the world economy, are you more or less optimistic since the June meeting of the ECB?
I'm guardedly optimistic because, like everybody else, I see this Delta variant and the impact that it has on people and on expectations. So I'm guardedly optimistic because the numbers are really good, because we still forecast a strong recovery that will be sustained in the next quarters. We have, as you know, revised our assessment of risk, and we see them as much more balanced than ever before since the beginning of the pandemic. But of course, we see that uncertainty on the horizon, which is caused by this Delta variant, which needs to be tamed with accelerated vaccination. You know, of sitting here in Venice on the occasion of the G20 that was concluded, if I haven't heard the word vaccination 1,000 times, I haven't heard it at all. Everybody is on the same page. It has to be accelerated vaccination in order to resist the uncertainty that will be caused by more and more variants, because that's the way this virus will evolve and morph into new forms.
And so was there a lot of worry in the G20, and are you very worried that actually another variant, or even this variant, scuppers the recovery? Could we actually deviate, or would it just take longer to have the same kind of recovery?
You know, for the moment, we are not revisiting or reducing projections. So we're still seeing this V-shaped recovery and a good improvement on all fronts. It's no longer manufacturing is buoyant, but services are lagging behind. Services are also picking up, and the social distancing removal that took place throughout Europe has helped a great deal in that respect. We see, you know, catching up. We see savings being used to a certain extent. We're not overly optimistic on that front, but we see some of that. We see some pent-up demand, not as much maybe as some would have expected. But as I said, it's all the signals are good, but we have this uncertainty that needs to be addressed, and needs to be addressed with something that is not economic, that is medical, and that has to do with the people.
Talk to me a little bit about the strategic review. I mean, this was a very big week for the ECB. What does it actually change in how you can achieve that 2% target?
Well, the big change is that we have revised our inflation target, and we are very committed to an inflation target. So we're not, it's not a vague, loose, ambiguous aim. It's a target. We want to reach the target of 2%. And that 2% is also a symmetric 2%. And we are looking obviously at a medium-term orientation, but symmetric 2% is what has been the major change. What do we mean by that? First of all, it's simple. You know, 2%, you don't, you know, wonder whether it's close to but below. No, it's 2%. That's what we want. That's what we're committed to. Second, it's solid, because it gives us the right space to maneuver in terms of monetary policy, and it's you know, it's a good. It probably reduces the welfare cost that would be associated with high inflation. So simple, solid, symmetric. And by that we mean 2% is not a ceiling, very important compared with what we had. And we also say symmetric means that we regard both deviations up or down, below 2%, above 2%, as undesirable. And the most important thing also is that we recognize the constraints resulting from the effective lower bound. And we recognize that in order to resist those constraints, we have to respond especially forcefully or persistently, and we accept that as a result of that, it may imply for a transitory period that inflation is moderately above target. So it's this package that from a pure monetary policy point of view has been critically important. There are other changes that are really interesting too that I'm happy to talk about.
Yeah, which we will. But I mean, if we spend a bit of time on that, so what is transitory? Is it a couple of months? Could it be longer than a quarter? And
transitory means that we are prepared to tolerate a period of time. We're not going to induce it. We're not going to deliberately go in that direction, but to accept that it will be the result of what is most important, which is the specially forceful or persistent action that we will take using all the tools we have. So I cannot tell you, in terms of how many months, how many quarters. This is something that is going to be judgmental and that will bring the Governing Council to use its discretion on the basis of the circumstances, on the basis of the trajectory, as to how transitory will be applied.
But it could be quarters?
I don't want to,
No.
Days, weeks, months, I don't want to give, a temporality to that transitory. But transitory means that it's a movement, it's a path.
I mean, and this is what the markets are trying to figure out, right? They're trying to really understand if what you said is hawkish or dovish, to put it.
I'm an owl, okay? So I'm not really interested in hawkish versus dovish and this ornithology business. I think what matters is the simple objective that we set for ourselves, the solidity of it, the symmetrical aspect, which is affirmed without any ambiguity, and the fact that we recognize the constraints, the pooling aspect of the effective lower bound, and that we are prepared to take the especially forceful measures or persistent measures because we are close to the effective lower bound. And that's really our commitment. But, markets would like to have the narrow precision to the extreme, and central banking has a little to do with judgment, has a little to do with an element of discretion about how we assess the situation and what response we want to give. But I think that, it's like we agreed on a constitution, okay? Because I operate with my legal brain as well. So it's as if we had agreed on a constitution. Now, after you've agreed on the constitution, unanimously, because the entire Governing Council was on board, then in response to circumstances, you have to agree on the law. And that's what will happen. But the law will be factored of circumstances and judgment within the parameters of our constitution.
So is it too soon to say whether it will push it back? It will push back normalization of some of the tools you're using, because effectively the inflation target is higher.
You could argue that marginally, to the extent that in the past the inflation aim was below but close to, and that now we are saying 2%. It's marginally higher as a target, and therefore might take a little longer. But frankly, I don't think that this is what matters most. What matters most is the especially forceful or persistent, and the tolerance for, or the acceptance and the tolerance for the fact that it might result transitorily in moderate variation relative to target.
So what does it change for your July 22nd meeting?
Well, we have a framework. We have a new framework that is unanimously approved by the Governing Council, and we're going to look at, as we always do every 6 weeks, we're going to look at the circumstances, we're going to look at what forward guidance we need to revisit, we're going to look at the calibration of all the tools we are using to make sure that it is aligned with our new strategy. And I think that, given the persistence that we need to demonstrate to deliver on our commitment, forward guidance will certainly be revisited.
Does it give you extra tools? So on July 22nd, it's actually it was always a big meeting, but it's an even bigger meeting because it's not only something technically, right? It's not technical change.
It's going to be an important meeting because, number one, we're going to communicate differently. So what analysts, experts, journalists are going to see is a slightly different presentation of our monetary policy decision. And I very much hope that it will be clearer, simpler, crisper, to the point, and as little jargonic as possible. That's one. Two, there will be a forward guidance review, because we have to align with the strategy review that we just completed. And my sense is that we will continue to be determined by maintaining favorable financing conditions in our economies, because we want to continue to support this recovery that is underway. So yeah, there will be some interesting variations and changes, both in terms of the substance, because forward guidance has to be aligned with the strategy, and because the way in which we're going to communicate it will be, I hope, clearer than it was.
Does it actually give you new tools, this strategy review?
Well, in the strategy review, we do two things. One is based on the fact that our so-called unconventional tools have been effective in avoiding a complete collapse that we would have had as a result of the pandemic. We didn't have that. So based on that effectiveness, we consider those quote-unquote unconventional tools as part and parcel tools of the toolbox. So those, whether you look at forward guidance, whether you look at asset purchase programs, whether you look at targeted refinancing, financing operations, or whether you look at, what did I forget in the process? No, that's it. No. And obviously on the top of our policy rates, including in negative territory as we have it at the moment. So all that is in the toolbox. And what we do, because we are planning for the next few years, at least I hope 5 years, we are saying that we reserve the option to create new tools. So that's, yeah, it's very flexible in that respect.
When's the right time to start talking about an exit strategy?
Oh, not now. Now is not the right time to talk about exit strategy, because we are still forcefully delivering under these exceptional circumstances using exceptional tool, which is the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, which I expect to last at least until March, and possibly to transition into a new format after March. That's what we see at the moment. But I think we need to be very flexible and not start, creating the anticipation that the exit is in the next few weeks, months.
No, but March. I mean, I guess the biggest concern. I don't know what your biggest concern in how we interpret central banks is that something happens, that inflation suddenly picks up and it's not telegraphed to the markets, and there's some kind of ugly event.
You know what? I wouldn't be so concerned about an inflation pickup, because there will be inflation pickup for sure. We are seeing it in most advanced economies and beyond, actually, and that is something that we regard as transitory, caused by energy prices, commodity prices. We are very attentive to the supply chain to see whether that mechanism is transmitted throughout the chain, from commodities and energy to producers' prices to consumer prices, and how the margins operate. And most importantly, we're looking at wages to see whether that is going to have an impact on wages negotiations, salaries, and all the rest of it. But for the moment, we are seeing that as transitory, and we should not respond to a transitory inflation moment, because what matters most is inflation expectations. And transitory inflation is not going to significantly impact those inflation expectations. But we are, this is the business that central banks are in, very attentive at how inflation evolves, but not, the sort of the blip or the cost push that we are seeing at the moment.
If the Fed moves and normalizes rates in 2022, which we're hearing more and more chatter, does it put pressure on the ECB?
We shall see.
Madame Lagarde, talk to me a little bit about climate change. So I know this was also one of the things in the strategic review. Does it mean that actually you'd be able to buy more, or will you buy more green bonds in asset purchases to help with the transition, or are you just looking at the balance sheet?
Thank you for mentioning climate change, because this has been a big push on my part to make sure that central banks, which are not the key drivers of that bus, actually does its part in fighting climate change. A limited part, not in the driver's seat, but its part. So we're going to do a few things. Number one, we're going to analyze in much more depth the impact of climate change and the impact of transitions by the corporate world and the impact of regulations, changes in the whole framework that will be decided by those who are in the driver's seat, governments and parliament. So we need to analyze that very carefully. We need to model that into our models. We need to anticipate all of that because it has an impact on the economy. Whether you look at inflation, whether you look at output, whether you look at cost structures, it has a significant impact. So that's number one. Number two, as far as we are concerned, we need to change the eligibility criteria that are in place in order to accept collaterals, to give them financing. And in these eligibility criteria, we will have to include, as soon as it's sort of put together and organized by the Commission, by those who are for Europe, by those who are in the driver's seat, all the information, all the disclosure that is required, and that will apply to how the value of corporates and enterprises in general is affected by climate change, and sooner or later it will also include what impact enterprises and corporates have on the environment itself. And soon it will include biodiversity and the threats to it. So eligibility criteria will change, information disclosure on an auditable and consistent and complete basis will be required, I think, and we have a timeline for that, we have an action plan, we know when we deliver. The third thing that will happen is that I think we will be buying more green bonds simply by virtue of the fact that there will be more green bond issuances in the future. We have been a big purchaser of green bonds ever since inception of green bonds, and we will continue being so. I think we buy 20% of all the green bonds that are available on the markets at the moment. That's a big chunk. And there will be more green issuance going forward. And I hope that Europe continues to have a very strong foothold on this particular market and develops on a much more cohesive and European-based manner in that respect.
I mean, do we need a unified carbon price? I mean, this is what everyone says, but will we get it?
That is highly desirable.
Yeah.
It's not something that is in our remit. No. But it's, all economists and pretty much everybody everywhere agrees that if you want to account for externalities, you need to price it. So if we emit, pollution of all sorts, it's not just CO2, it will be methane, it will be lots of other things. That has to be priced in so that risks are properly reflected. You were talking about risks. That's something that we will also assess very carefully when we look at our balance sheets. Our balance sheet has a lot of sovereign bonds. We're not proposing to weigh in any shape or form by reference to climate change those bonds. But the corporate bonds that we hold, which is a very small part of it, has to be properly assessed, taking into account the risks associated with climate change. Not the case at the moment.
But are we getting better at avoiding greenwashing? So I know we've done leaps and bounds, but actually this is still a serious problem, especially when you look at the transition and how you measure that.
Yeah. That is going to require a lot of efforts on the part of regulators, meaning governments and parliament. It's going to require a lot of effort on the part of the private sector that is in charge of revising and certifying the accuracy and the validity of the accounts. So the accounting firms, the auditing firms, the standard setters are going to have to work really hard in the weeks and months to come to reach a level where we can actually value what is green, what is not so green, and what is not green at all. And it's not to say that that will not be financed, because the transition will have to be financed, for sure. But the how you calibrate, how you rate, how you value is going to be changed.
Can you talk to me a little bit about digital euro? So I know there's, this week coming up is an important first step. Is the second step actually like using it and being able to go a step further, almost a given at this point?
In the next couple of days, actually on my Bastille Day, the Governing Council of the ECB will decide whether to go into this exploratory phase, which we believe will take a couple of years. It's not something that you can just, you don't flip it as a dime. You have to really look into all the technicalities, the design, how you make sure that the banking sector is actually part of the story, and because we're not planning on disintermediating the banks, they have to be really part of the story and part of the action. We have to look at the privacy issues. We have to look at a lot of issues that are in a way beyond the realm of central banks. So we need to collaborate with the other authorities such as ministers of finance, European Commission, parliaments, because in due course it will touch people's life in a very intimate way. And what we've heard from the people is that they want privacy to be protected. But at the same time, we need to make sure that it's not accelerating anti-money laundering or the financing of terrorism. So we have, on each and every aspect, we have to strike the right balance. And so that will take a couple of years. And in a couple of years, when the work has been completed, the Governing Council will have to decide green light, red light, there we go or not.
So it's not a given at this point?
It's not a given yet. My suspicion is that the Governing Council will be very supportive to explore for the next 2 years. And hopefully will commit the budget to do that, because it's not without some cost. But then in 2 years' time, whether it's a let's go and have a digital euro or not, I think will be then decisive.
Madame Lagarde, if you look at the markets, and this, we're trying to figure out exactly what the market is looking at, and I don't know whether there's a problem with how they look at the real economy, or whether, especially the bond market, is looking at, things in China that makes it difficult to get out of COVID-19. But what's the relationship that you have with markets right now? Do you try and figure out what they're looking at, or is it kind of very separate?
Well, we try to understand their thinking, their rational, their expectations, and clearly, I don't talk to markets myself, and I refrain from that, because I think this is my duty to stay out of it. But we do have people who are on the markets. I mean, you cannot be a big purchaser without actually having some proximity with how markets operate and what is their thinking, what is their rational, what is their expectations. Expectations in particular are critically important. So we have market surveys that market participants participate in, and that we look at. It's not the only component that we look at. We look at all sorts of indicators and survey to understand what they see, what they understand of us. So it's a bit of an interesting
feedback loop almost.
Constant feedback loop. But when we are here riveted and determined by one objective, which is price stability that we have to deliver for Europeans. That is the most important thing. Markets obviously play their part, and we have to be attentive to how they think and what they expect and how they see things. But our objective is price stability, and that is what prevails over anything that we do. And we've just decided that we will deliver 2%, which we define as price stability.
And you're confident that you'll be able to
We have to do it. We have to do it. The treaty tells us price stability. The Governing Council unanimously says we target 2%. We have to use the tools, and we have a big toolbox to actually deliver that 2%.
So is that
much healthier to actually be at 2%. Right. We don't want to be in that deflationary situation.
So is that really what's changed? Actually, that you think compared to the previous era, you'll be able to achieve that target because of the strategic review?
I hear that music of, well, you have not achieved. And I also hear what would have happened had we not done what we did. It's all a story of counterfactuals. Had the ECB not been on the ball very quickly, very massively, we would have seen growth much, much lower than that, and the much deeper than what it has been. We would have seen inflation at much lower levels as well. So let's just make sure that the economy is favorably financed, that enterprises invest, employ, that people train and get the right skill set. And there is a very, very large fiscal support that is coming in with the next generation EU package that is now beginning to not only be raised but being paid to countries in order to become greener, in order to become more digital. That's a very important aspect of it.
But from where you're sitting, you're feeling good about it.
It's difficult not to feel good sitting in Venice. And it's not difficult feeling good once you've achieved this sort of unanimous support of the Governing Council with all national central banks around the ECB determined to deliver 2%.
Thank you so much.